For nearly 40 years, people around the Ozarks opened their morning paper anticipating what Springfield Newspaper Inc. editorial cartoonist Bob Palmer had to say about local, regional, and national news. While many viewers will be familiar with Palmer's work, his life before he came to Springfield, and the Springfield cartoonists who came before him may be fresh news. Prior to the late 1920s, Springfield's newspapers relied on nationally syndicated cartoons to fill their editorial cartoon panel.
In 1925, the Springfield News Leader hired nationally renowned cartoonist Wallace McDougall to depict in pictures and stories, as the leader said, the activities of Springfield men and women who contributed to the upbuilding of Springfield. But as you'll see, no women ever made the cut for what would become McDougall's series, Sketches of Springfield Men.
A cartoonist for publications like the Chicago Examiner and the San Francisco Post, McDougall was traveling the country on a Get Acquainted with the Public tour and had already visited New York, Ohio, and Illinois. In the weeks before he came to Springfield, McDougall sketched leading community men for the Kansas City Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Sedalia Democrat. McDougall's Sketches of Springfield Men began in July of 1925 and ran through the end of that year, profiling notable men like entrepreneur John T. Woodruff, Francis Xavier Herr of the Herr's department store on the Springfield Square, and Boy Scout band leader R. Ritchie Robertson.
The first instance I could find of the Springfield newspapers hiring an actual cartoonist was when the Springfield leader hired McAlester, Oklahoma native Baird Martin around 1928. Though Martin's cartooning career in Springfield was short-lived, he created an indelible contribution to Springfield history with his 45-part series, The History of Springfield.
The series began at the end of February 1929 and ran daily through April. With each strip including at least 3 panels, Martin documented well over 100 incidents in Springfield's history, from the arrival of the Campbell family and the establishment of churches and businesses, to the laying out of the events that led to the Battle of Wilson's Creek, to the historical milestones that were, at the time, in relatively recent memory, like the building of the Metropolitan Hotel and the establishment of Drury University, then called Drury College. That summer, Martin began another short-lived series featuring prominent areas around Springfield, but the sketches were filled with mistakes, including this drawing of the Woodruff Building, which includes 15 intentional errors. The first reader to catch the most mistakes in the drawing won a cash prize of $2. Martin continued his interest in Springfield happenings, both current, like when he looked in on a charcoal sketching from life class given by the Springfield Museum of Art Association, and historic, as in this article about the early days of the Springfield Fire Department. There are also a few instances of a column called Old Days in Springfield, written and illustrated by Martin. Not long after the History of Springfield series ended in April of 1929, Martin revisited the idea with a monthly rundown of happenings around the city, beginning with Cartoon History of Springfield, June 1929. These recaps appeared monthly in the Sunday News and Leader for the rest of Martin's tenure in Springfield before he returned to Oklahoma.
Wisconsin native Charles Warner took over cartooning responsibilities for Martin after he left around 1930. And while he was here, Charles Warner was an avid collector of original cartoons from some of the country's leading editorial cartoonists. He used the cartoons for inspiration that would soon lead Warner to his own amazing accomplishments.
It is the Cartoon History of Springfield series that gives us an idea of when Warner took over for Martin, as Martin's last entry in the series covered March of 1930, and by the April 1930 entry, it was Charles Warner drawing it. Either Warner or Springfield newspapers tried to put his own stamp on the series by changing the name to Around the Town, but within a few months, the series was back to being called Cartoon History of Springfield. And even though it was Martin who started the series, Warner continued to do it all 5 years he worked for Springfield newspapers, so that in the end, it was really Charles Warner's series. Besides the cartoon history series, Warner also caricatured some of the Ozarks' most prominent residents, from local figures such as Springfield Fire Chief William Riley Price and Springfield Mayor Harry D. Durst, to more colorful characters of Ozarks legend, like the doctor known around the area as the Wizard of Odo. He also poked fun at scenes around Springfield, like when he caricatured how Springfield High School students spent their lunch break. But he also illustrated more serious events, like the criminal careers of Ozarks bandits Leonard Short, Dewey Gilmore, and Dan Heady. One of Warner's most interesting contributions to Springfield's cartoon history is his comic strip, Luke Flint, Ace Sleuth of the Ozarks, created in partnership with writer Alan Oliver, which began appearing in July of 1934 and included such character creations as Anne Marsh, Max Maloney, and Luke's bulbous and bumbling sidekick, Eustace Twitch.
Charles Warner left Springfield Newspapers, Inc. in 1935 to take a staff artist job with the Daily Oklahoman, and soon he became their editorial cartoonist. It was there just a few years later that Warner became the youngest person to win a Pulitzer Prize for an editorial cartoon. And though Warner went on to have an illustrious career filled with accolades, he never forgot Springfield, and Springfield never forgot Charles Warner.
In early 1941, Chicago merchant Marshall Field III offered Warner the position of chief editorial cartoonist on his new newspaper, the Chicago Sun. Shortly thereafter, Springfield Newspapers, Inc. made arrangements with the Sun to publish Warner's cartoons. The Springfield paper noted, "And so Charlie, a hometown boy who made good in a great way, indirectly returns to Springfield." Warner's cartoons for the Sun were well received nationally, but his relations with the paper were not comfortable. Warner left the Sun in 1947 for the Indianapolis Star. Stories from Warner's life appear periodically in the Springfield papers, including when he donated most of his cartoons to Syracuse University in August of 1966. And for the May 2, 1989 edition of the Springfield Leader and Press, the paper recreated the front page from 50 years earlier, which featured none other than Charles Warner's Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoon, which originally appeared in the Daily Oklahoman on October 6, 1938.
While Warner may have had the distinction of being the youngest person to win a Pulitzer Prize for an editorial cartoon, he was not the youngest person employed by the Springfield newspapers as a cartoonist. That honor goes to Warner's successor, Jon Kennedy, who joined the newspaper's staff while still a student at Central High School, and who went on to become one of Springfield's most prolific cartoonists.
Jon Kennedy began his senior year of high school in 1935. The same year, he began working for Springfield Newspapers, Inc. The 1936 senior high school yearbook includes a frontispiece by Kennedy depicting how the Springfield Public Square may have looked 66 years earlier in 1870. Kennedy became well known for his ability to capture the likeness of any subject. Whether the subject leaned toward the more humorous, like Kennedy's from-life sketches of area farmers compared to the bearded hill folk of Kennedy's imagination, or if the subject were depicted on a more somber occasion, like when Kennedy sketched the likeness of recently deceased Robertson School student Mary Frances Goss. One of Kennedy's most important character contributions came in the form of the regular series Minute Biographies, which featured profiles of leading Springfield men accompanied by a sketch from Kennedy. Minute Biographies captured the likeness of such well-known Springfield men as Dr. Roy Ellis, president of Southwest Missouri State Teachers College, Chief of Police and World War I veteran Paul Alfonso Frey, and Ozarks weatherman Charles Claiborne Williford. Kennedy took an interest in sports with his regular feature Under the Microscope, and in society with his series Society Merry-Go-Round, which featured unidentified caricatures of popular women in Springfield society, along with clues as to the identity of the subjects. Kennedy broadened his society subject base with a yearly feature like this one, Socialites of 1940, which featured Drury fraternity brother Charles Brown, Mrs. James Montgomery Schneider, involved in numerous local charities, and Ralph Mack, who recently threw, as the paper noted, a top-notch stag affair for a newly married groom. Kennedy left Springfield in 1941 to work for the Arkansas Democrat, but he poked some fun at himself while he was here, like when he imagined how he'd fare as vice president of the Ozarks Artists Association.
Now, before I tell you about Kennedy's successor, my favorite cartoonist, who many viewers will be familiar with from her work in another medium, I'd like to tell you about a couple of the cartoonists who were working at the same time in Springfield in the decades that Saul, Martin, Warner, Kennedy, and all of the cartoonists that came after them. The first one is cartoonist John A. Patterson, born in 1905 into a prominent Springfield family that included numerous lawyers and U.S. Senator Roscoe Patterson. You'll remember that I mentioned that Kennedy was the youngest cartoonist ever employed by Springfield Newspapers, Inc., but he was not the youngest cartoonist to ever have a cartoon appear in a Springfield newspaper. That distinction goes to Patterson, who in 1918, at the age of 12 and at the height of World War I, had his cartoon depicting the German Kaiser being chased by a bulldog published in the Springfield Republican.
While the Republican cartoon has yet to be located, Patterson occasionally had cartoons printed in the Springfield newspapers, namely when accompanying a letter to the editor, like in this clipping. Patterson began his cartooning career in Chicago, where he worked alongside the likes of Frank Willard, creator of Moon Mullins, George Clark, creator of Side Glances, and J.R. Williams, creator of Out Our Way. By the late 1930s, Patterson had a daily editorial cartoon panel, Folks We Know, featuring everyday people in sometimes precarious situations, but always with a dose of humor. Despite some success publishing syndicated cartoons, Patterson made the majority of his living drawing for trade publications. A 1945 article mentioned that Patterson had worked for over 150 magazines and publications in the US, Canada, or England through the Newspaper Enterprise Association service. The same article stated that companies that had used his drawings included General Motors, Maytag, and DuPont. Around the 1950s, Patterson started his own card company, Pat Prints, and earned some notoriety by producing a new type of greeting card known as a studio card, which tended toward the more humorous than sentimental. In one instance, a bride and groom are featured on the front of a card that reads, "Now that you're getting married, have you been told about the birds and the bees?" When you open the card, you will find a definition for a bird and a bee. Patterson extended his catalog of cards to include regular, though still humorous, greeting cards for every occasion. Patterson's cards could be found in such stores as Macy's and Gimbel's in New York, or Famous Bar of St. Louis. They could also be found, he liked to point out, in towns such as Branson and Ozark. The colors on the cards are still vibrant. Interestingly, Patterson created the idea for and sketched out the cards, while his wife Mildred did all of the coloring work. After Patterson's death in 1984, Mildred continued operating Pat Prints until her retirement, piecing together drawings of John's to create new cards. The Springfield-Greene County Library's collection of Patterson's work includes nearly 300 cartoons, greeting cards, and photographs.
At the same time Patterson was doing work for syndicates and for trade publications, local cartoonist Art Omens was building a reputation for himself around the Ozarks as a hillbilly cartoonist, a distinction that brought Omens a lot of pride.
Omens was born in Springfield in 1917, the son of a draftsman and a fashion artist. According to Omens, it was only natural that as soon as he was tall enough to reach over his crib, he started scribbling on the wall. His father papered the room with drawing paper, and when one section was full, his mother would move the crib to a clean piece of wall. Omens sold his first cartoon to Front Page Detective magazine in 1937. The Springfield-Greene County Library's collection of Omens material, which contains over 600 cartoons and advertisements and over 400 photographs, includes numerous drawings featuring prisoners, wardens, and crimes, with a humorous slant, of course. Omens served during World War II, spending time at Fort Leonard Wood. While he was there, he continued cartooning, sometimes on matters related to the soldiering life, sometimes on situations a bit more Ozarks. After the war, Omens became a staff artist for Gospel Publishing House, one of a handful of artists working on their publications. Omens even created cutout nativity scenes for the publishing house at Christmas. Omen's real pride and joy, though, were cartoons that spoke to his Ozarks roots, finding the charm in the Ozarks hillbilly with his book, Ozarks Portraits. In the introduction, Omen states, "The true hillbilly is very shy and doesn't take to city folks, so he won't often hang around where he can be peered at. He seldom comes out of the backwoods, and then it must be a very special occasion. Their tales and customs have always fascinated me. I believe you'd like them too. So let's take off our shoes and relax with the Ozark mountain folk." Omens also did some work for a humorous gag newspaper called the Hickoryville Prevaricator. Omen's drawings can be seen in the story of Dr. Snortsnozzle and various hill folk, like Wild Kiat Annie and numerous pipe-puffing Ozarkers referred to as Old Hick. As part of his commercial artwork, Omens also sketched advertisements for various products, including Hallam & Son Inc.'s pure old-fashioned peanut butter, and area restaurants like Springfield staple Leong's. Included in the library's Omens collection are numerous product labels, restaurant advertisements, business cards, letters from other cartoonists, character sketches, ref sketches, slides, snapshots, and even a few self-portraits.
Now we get to Jon Kennedy's successor, my favorite cartoonist, and the only female cartoonist in the history of Springfield newspapers, and one of the few female cartoonists working before the mid-20th century. Her work is legendary around Springfield. Not her cartooning work, but her photography. The female cartoonist I'm speaking of is none other than famed photojournalist Betty Love. When she took the cartooning job in the summer of 1941, it was only meant to be a summer gig. But of course, Betty ended up staying with the newspaper for nearly 35 years.
Betty Love was descended from two prominent Springfield families, graduated from Drury College, and eventually became an art teacher at McGregor Elementary and Jarrett Junior High School. She was a well-known entity around Springfield for her artwork, so she was a natural, though uncommon, choice when the newspaper cartoonist position opened up. Betty's cartooning career spanned the years of World War II, and her perspective is unique because she saw the war and the home front efforts through a woman's eyes. Many of her cartoons address the lives of women, whether it's a mother juggling a million tasks on Mother's Day, a grandmother helping care for her grandchildren while her daughter works, teenage girls looking longingly out at the nightlife in Springfield, or merely the changing notions of how women were supposed to look. But she could also pull on heartstrings, helping raise donations for the war effort. She could project patriotism into the act of raising of the American flag, make the viewer question if they were using the war to make excuses. She could also instill a sense of civic duty, whether to raise funds for the Springfield Boys Club, speak to the treatment of good school teachers, or for that matter, the treatment of children around the world affected by the war. She even spoke to the hope that next year would be different. The library's archives include just a handful of Betty's cartoons, including these, which were likely used in her regular recap of the week in Springfield, or as part of the Good Old Days column, which recounted events from 50 years prior.
When the newspaper's photographer, John McGuire, was drafted to serve in World War II in early 1945, Betty took up the camera, teaching herself darkroom techniques and how to gather news with the camera. In the process, she became one of the first female press photographers in the nation and a pioneer in the use of color photography in daily newspapers.
Betty served as the photographer for Springfield Newspapers, Inc. for decades, and in that time, she covered any event you could think of, from serious events like the burning and rebuilding of local businesses, tragic accidents and their aftermaths, portraits of people living in poverty, to heartwarming and hopeful activities like visiting the library's bookmobile, to profiles on people in the community with interesting professions, and maybe once, a chimpanzee. Betty once unwittingly placed herself in the middle of a free speech controversy when she photographed two local bank robbery suspects being transported to Springfield's Federal Building in 1947. To the chagrin of U.S. Marshal Fred Canfill, who ordered her not to shoot the pictures of the unnamed suspects, she photographed them anyway. Canfill's reaction made national headlines, along with stories of Canfill's chummy connection to Harry S. Truman. The event was so notable that Love's successor, Scott Shadburn, portrayed it in one of his daily cartoon panels.
After Betty's retirement in 1975, the Springfield Art Museum featured 150 of her photographs in a month-long display. From the darkroom, a database created by the Springfield-Greene County Public Library in partnership with the Springfield News Leader features almost 30,000 images from the newspaper's history, many of them taken by Betty Love. And even though her photography has been preserved, unfortunately, her original cartoons had either been lost to history or, hopefully, are still at large somewhere.
Will Scott Shadburn, a native of Windsor near Kansas City, joined Springfield Newspapers, Inc. in January of 1944 as a reporter on the Daily News. Shadburn spent a year as a nightside police reporter, but he also began cartooning alongside Betty Love, notable in his regular Springfield Smiles panel. Once he became the full-time cartoonist, Shadburn covered everything from international relations to that particular piece one finds while Christmas shopping. One of Shadburn's greatest contributions to Springfield's cartoon history came in the form of a short-lived series created in partnership with eventual newspaper editor Dale Freeman called How Came the Name? Surprisingly, the series, which told the story of how different Ozarks towns got their names, was not popular with the editor or the newspaper's readers, so it was discontinued after about 20 segments. But Shadburn and Freeman formed a deep friendship. Shadburn even created a stamp for Freeman to use in the books in his personal library, telling just what would happen if a borrowed book went unreturned. Sadly, Shadburn committed suicide in January of 1953. On the day of his death, where his panel would normally be, the paper ran a white space with Shadburn's name, lifespan, and -30-, which in the newspaper world signifies the end of a story.
After Shadburn's suicide, the Springfield News Leader once again relied on nationally syndicated cartoonists to fill their newspaper editorial cartoon column. It was just a few months later, near the end of April 1953, that Bob Palmer, the man whose cartoons would greet Ozarkers each morning for the next few decades, came to Springfield. Robert Nielsen Palmer was born in 1920 in New York City, the oldest son of a well-to-do New York contractor. Bob's father died when Bob was just a young boy, at a time when Bob was recovering from polio, an illness that left him paralyzed for an entire year and bedridden for almost 2. But Bob's widowed mother moved the family to Manhasset, Long Island, and it was there that Bob not only developed his love of cartooning, but grew strong enough to play varsity football, ice hockey, and lacrosse while in high school.
Palmer became interested in cartooning at a young age, learning to draw with this instructional manual, The Boy and Girl Cartoonist, featuring 68 complete lessons in cartooning. Palmer attended commercial art school in New York City before joining the American Field Service, where he served as an ambulance driver with the British 8th Army. Once his contract expired, Palmer came home to the States and arrived just in time to be drafted by the American Army in 1943. After the war, Palmer met and married his wife, Nancy Ellis, more affectionately known as Nan. The couple eventually had 2 children together, Robert and Wade. During the late 1940s, Palmer held a variety of cartooning positions. He edited a facsimile paper for the New York Times, drew comic books and ghosted comic strips, and, as evidenced from the artwork he left behind, did some work in drawing women's fashions. perhaps sold work to detective magazines like Art Omens, and even did some cartooning for the newspaper in Manhasset. His first big cartooning opportunity came during the summer of 1952, when he was hired by the New York Daily News. It was on the strength of the Daily News cartoons that Palmer landed the job with the Springfield newspapers. Palmer's first cartoon for the Springfield newspapers appeared on April 30th, 1953, and was a touching tribute to his predecessor and the big shoes Palmer had to fill. Palmer quickly decided that Springfield was home, enjoying the freedoms provided him by his editors. He was often written about in the Springfield papers, usually for his various accolades, and in one article, Palmer expresses his appreciation by saying, "In my daily cartoons, I can swing any way I wish. The freedom an editor gives a cartoonist is an important determining factor in his development." Palmer always worked a day ahead, studying local, regional, national, and international news for inspiration, usually carrying a pocket full of notes with him to the drawing board. He became known for his unique ability to capture not only the likeness, but personality of his subjects. His career spanned not only numerous Springfield mayors and city managers, but the terms of 8 U.S. presidents. Palmer found John F. Kennedy difficult to caricature because, other than his bushy hair, there was not much distinction to his features. For Harry Truman, Palmer focused on Truman's glasses and nose. When asked who his easiest cartoon subject was over the years, the answer was simple: Nixon. I could draw him with my eyes closed, Palmer said. Palmer was nominated for and won numerous national awards, once winning a coveted Freedom Foundation Award every year for over a decade. And his cartoons were reprinted in newspapers from coast to coast, even frequently being reprinted in the New York Times.
When Bob retired in the summer of 1991, he left a legacy of more than 10,000 editorial cartoons that, as one of his fellow journalists put it, entertained many, enraged some, but enlightened all. As for his retirement plans, Bob continued to do what he loved outside of work for all the decades that he was working, reveling in his family and friends, keeping active, and growing crops in his backyard that were the envy of every other gardener in town. When Bob passed away in October of 1999, he was remembered as the best known and the most influential Springfield journalist of his era. Afterwards, the Springfield newspaper never replaced him. He was irreplaceable.
The Springfield-Greene County Library's various physical and digital collections of Palmer's materials include around 500 cartoons, character sketches, comic panels, publications, and pictures.
Now, you may think the story ends here, but not quite. When Bob Palmer moved to Springfield in 1953, little did he know that he would end up sharing a fence with a young boy named Charles Frederick, who had both a talent for drawing and a willingness to learn.
Charles Frederick was born into a notable Springfield family. His grandfather helped develop the Galloway neighborhood of Springfield, and his father, Paul Frederick, was an accomplished tennis star while attending Drury College. Frederick became interested in art around the age of 10, copying from his comic books to learn about movement and character features. In his early teens, he had, as he called it, a stroke of good fortune that would accelerate him on his path to becoming an artist when he met Bob Palmer, who became a mentor to Frederick. Despite his busy schedule, Palmer encouraged Frederick's talents by giving him cartoons to study, and always found time to view Frederick's first forays into editorial cartooning, which, as you can see, bore a striking similarity to Palmer's style. Frederick carried his love of cartooning through high school, publishing work in the Parkview High School newspaper, and into college, where he was paid to do sports cartoons for the Baylor University Lariat. Frederick spent much of his cartooning career with the Oak Cliff Tribune, a newspaper near Dallas, Texas, where he sketched everything from new developments in American diets to his mentor and friend's favorite president to depict, Richard Nixon. In his later life, Frederick returned to the Ozarks and, Around 2012, the Ozarks mountaineer published a series of sketches Frederick created to illustrate letters written by his grandfather, Charles Henry Frederick, who was born in 1879. The letters offer valuable insight into life in the Ozarks at the turn of the 20th century, and Frederick's cartoons helped bring those stories to life. Whether depicting local advancements in business and industry, the politics at play around the region, the larger picture of world relations, or merely a small snapshot into everyday life around the Ozarks, cartoons not only have the ability to succinctly offer social commentary, they capture the history of a place, a time, and for Springfield and the Ozarks, no one's legacy shines brighter than Bob Palmer's, who, for almost 40 years, or to put it another way, well over 13,000 mornings, gave people something to think about and perhaps changed a few hearts and minds. If you have questions or would like to find out more about the library's efforts to preserve the cartoon history of the Ozarks, please reach out. Thank you for joining me for this presentation of Sketches from Springfield.